first slide, you see my favorite antidote. So it's quite nice to open the talk with this image. I mean, the tag is a bit misleading because you will notice very quickly that it's not really about complexity, but it's rather about a certain sense of simplicity, maybe the sense of simplicity implied in the Galenic notion of simple medicaments. On the next slide, you see an overview of my talk. It will be a very simple structure. So in the first section, I will give some conceptual clarifications. And in the second section, there will be a case study about early modern reductionism. And there I will mainly speak about Thomas Erastus. And in the third section, I will present a case study about emergentism in early modern pharmacology. And here I will mainly focus on the work of Girolamo Mercuriale. On the third slide, you see a portrait of one of the two main protagonists. That's Thomas Erastus, who was a professor of medicine and rector at the University of Heidelberg in the period where the Palatinate was reformed. So he was able to stay there even after the Lutherans were forced to leave the university. And later in his life, he became a professor of ethics at the University of Basel. And on the next slide, you see the portrait of Girolamo Mercuriale, who was a professor of medicine in Padua and then Bologna and then Pisa. So he just collected the most prestigious academic appointments available in his time, and especially relevant for this discussion about Galenic notions in pharmacology. He was also a consultant for the Junta edition of the Latin translations of Galen's Opera Omnia. So I will directly plunge into the first section. So that's the next slide. Exactly. So that's the section heading of the sort of a stage setting section, some conceptual clarification. If you go to the next slide, you see some remarks about reductionism. So reductionism could be described as the view that the powers of a material composite is identical with the sum of the powers of its individual constituents. If true, then the phenomena on the level of composites can be explained by the qualities and quantities of and the relations between their constituents. In early modern texts, this idea is widely expressed by using the expression that the powers of the composite can be reduced, with the Latin reduci, to the powers of their constituents. Perhaps no early modern thinker was a reductionist about everything, especially not about the origin of the human soul, but it should be uncontroversial that some early modern thinkers were reductionists about some of the powers of some of the composites. So perhaps more controversial is the suggestion that there were early modern natural philosophers who embraced emergentism. To dispel the impression of anachronism, consider that emergentism is view that material composites and give rise to novel causal properties that are not reducible to the sum of the causal properties of their composites, is a view that goes back to antiquity. The most unambiguous formulation of the idea is found in Alexander of Aphrodisias. According to Alexander, the soul, and that's the quotation you find on the slide, the soul is a power and form which supervenes through such a mixture upon the temperament of bodies. And it is not a proportion or a composition of the temperament. Victor who has also offered this English translation, has argued that talk about supervenience should here be taken in the technical sense of co-variation of mental states with bodily states. Moreover, Kasten emphasizes that for Alexander, the soul possesses powers that are more than the aggregates of the powers of the elements. Likewise, Alexander points out that some medicaments possess powers that arise from their temperament. Since this remark stems from the context of his criticism of the harmony theory of the soul, the implication again seems to be that these are powers that go beyond the powers inherent in the harmony of elementary qualities. In the sense that Alexander ascribes distinct new powers to souls as well as to the forms of non-animate composites such as chemical blends, Kasten characterizes Alexander as one of the ancient thinkers who were committed to emergentism. Medieval philosophy too, deviant versions of emergentism, deviant due to the greater emphasis on celestial causation in the actualization of the potentialities of matter, have been influential. Emergentism remained a viable option in the 16th and early 17th century, as can be seen in thinkers such as Jacopo Zabarella, Santorio Santori, Jacob Scheck, Nicolaus Taurellus, Juan Gallego de la Serna, and Antonio Ponce de Santa Cruz. Terminologically, this idea was often expressed by saying that the new causal powers are educed, Latin eduti, from the mixtures of elementary components. So in what follows, I would like to argue that the distinction between reductionism and emergentism also could shed light on some aspects of the 16th century debate about antidotes, and I will focus on Thomas Erastus and Girolamo Mercurialis, just for the reason that these two thinkers are maybe the most outspoken proponents of reductionism and emergentism, respectively. So, but before going into the details of Erastus's and Mercurialis theories, it may be useful to introduce some of the themes discussed in the 16th century debates about antidotes. That's slide number 8. So one of the central issues of 16th century debates about antidotes was the interpretation of the Galenic notion of action of the whole substance. This can be seen, for instance, in a long preface that Johannes Goreus, Jean de Bouilly, a member of the Paris Medical Faculty, published in 1549 to the Latin translation of Menander of Colophon's Alexipharmac. This preface gives hints at some of the available theoretical options, but also conveys a good sense of how puzzling early moderns found the workings of antidotes. Goreus holds that not all poisons have a perceptible preponderance of manifest quality. This is why he thinks that there is a kind of poison that involves other kinds of causation. One causal relation holds between the poison and the animal affected. As he says, if the poison is contrary to the animal by its whole substance, it must be contrary to the most noble and excellent part of the animal in which life is situated. Here, Boreus alludes to the physiological idea that poisons kill by injuring the substance of the heart. Another causal relation holds between poisons and antidotes. Poisons act by their whole substance, also antidotes must act through their whole substance. Boreus surmises Galen had this complex web of relations in mind when he said that the nature of antidotes is an intermediary between the nature of the body and the nature of the poison. The antidote cannot be too similar to the poison because otherwise it would be poisonous. And it also cannot be too similar to the body because otherwise the poison would be poisonous for the antidote. In Boreus's view, this is also why prophylactic antidotes, or so-called alexithymia, can be taken only in small quantities. Does not imply that the temperament would be relevant for understanding the actions of this kind of antidote. Boreus describes the origin of the powers of the whole substance as follows. That's what you have on the slide. Human being is tempered through elements and primary qualities in one way, and the viper in another way. And out of temperament of this kind, some properties of the substance emerge. And in this consists the form and species of each thing. Hence, those beings which act in this way are said to act through their whole substance and their whole genus and species. To give examples, to the examples that he gives belong the vegetative powers of attraction, retention, nutrition, and excretion. As he comments, it is easy to understand composites through simples in such a way that also a third entity emanates from the first two. Implicitly counts poisons and prophylactic antidotes among these third entities. Now, on the next slide, you see that not everyone agreed with this reading of the notion of actions of whole substance. And one of the people who disagreed with the reading presented by Boreus is Gabriele Fallocchio, who identified the temperament with the form of the mixture. And he took this also the view of Galen. So you see also the ambiguities and the disagreements about how to interpret Galen. So Fallocchio says, the mixture is called a mixture due to the qualities that follow from the substance or due to the substance itself. And for this reason, the qualities are rightly said to be the form of the mixture. For the next quotation, we say that actions arise from the power, that actions of natural things are that they preserve and augment themselves, which would not happen unless they win over what is contrary to them. These are the causes of the actions of powers, and the powers of heat, coldness, humidity, and dryness make hot, cold, humid, and dry. Since likewise the secondary powers, that is, temperaments, are active and fight to preserve their nature, and these are said to act by their whole substance. So here you get an impression that there was also a reductionist way of thinking about actions of the whole substance, and it was the view that the wholeness relevant is something like, well, it's not an action by only one elementary quality, but by all of the elementary qualities at the same time, plus their mutual modification. So in a sense, I mean, you see, it's not just like people thought you just have to open some text by Galen, and there you have the answer. It was really a controversy, and that's the background of this disagreement between Thomas Erastus and Girolamo Mercuriali, to which I turn now. So slide 10 is the heading of the second reductionism in Erastus's account of Antidotes. And I think Erastus is interesting because he spells out these reductionist intuitions in much more detail. So one step that Erastus takes and that you find on the next slide is the idea that the notion of elementary forms should be reinterpreted. So this suggestion is that there are two identifiable senses of forms of elements, and I think the point is of course a critical point because in a way he eliminates the traditional notion of substantial forms of elements. So the first sense in which he would allow talk about forms of elements is in the first quotation where he says, if you consider elements as bodies that subsist by themselves and as parts of the world, there is no doubt that they subsist by their substantial actuality. This actuality or form is nothing other than their subsistence, but it is nevertheless not the cause of why they enter mixture and generate each other through mutual action and being acted upon. Second sense of form is expressed in the second quotation where Erastus writes, we say that primary qualities are the forms of elements insofar as they are elements of the mixture, not insofar as they are bodies, parts of the world that subsist by themselves. For as the matter of elements is the element of mixed bodies, so are their qualities, as it were, some elements not of mixtures, but of the temperament that is in mixtures. So these arguments against substantial forms of elements do not imply that Erastus excludes the notion of substantial form from his ontology. So if you look into other parts of his writings, you see that he allows still the possibility that souls can be analyzed as substantial forms. But on the lower level of the hierarchy of being, he clearly eliminates the notion. And I think that's an important first. In the doctoral dissertation about the concept of diseases of the whole substance, as well as in some of his medical letters, Erastus discusses the question of how pharmacological actions of the whole substance could be analyzed. As he notes, Galen's concept of action of the whole substance can be applied to diseases and medicaments. For instance, it applies to medicaments that cure diseases of the whole substance of body parts. Since substantial forms cannot act directly on qualities, this raises the question of whether there are substantial forms of medicaments that operate on the substantial forms by body parts. As Erastus points out, this question is particularly relevant for the treatment of poisons through antidotes. Erastus considers the view that the disease of the whole substance could be identified with the putrefaction of the affected body part that is an affection of the mixture. He traces this view back to Galen, but he rejects this view. Instead, he follows Avicenna's view that the relevant affection of the mixture consists in the secondary temperament. exio secunda. That is, the temperament that results from the mixtures of the mixed bodies that constitute an organism. Erastus tried to reconcile Galen's and Avicenna's views by claiming that Galen sometimes distinguishes the temperament from the whole substance. But as he says, we deny that he always understands the same under the term temperament. According to Erastus, sometimes Galen speaks out about the manifest or sensible quality that arises from the confusion of primary quality. Temperament, in this sense, consists in the modified powers of the dominant quality, which, for Erastus, is not identical with the whole substance. Sometimes Galen speaks about the temperament that arises from the temperaments of different parts of the mixture. Temperament, in this sense, for Erastus, is identical with the whole substance. This is why he concludes that diseases of the whole substance are diseases of the temperament in the second sense. Analogously, he takes medicaments that act by their whole substance still to act through their primary qualities. So, like 13. So, line of argument is continued in Erastus's medical correspondence. For example, in a letter to Conrad Gessler, Erasmus writes about the origin of errors about poisons and their cures. He notes that poison is sometimes believed to differ from pernicious perfection, but he thinks that this is really an error. It's an error that is prevented by the insight that treatment in both cases must consist in the restoration of the temperament of humors. Antidotes are causally efficacious because their qualities are contrary to the qualities of poisons, and the goal is the expulsion of poisons through contrary qualities. Because the causal mechanisms are similar to those operative in medicaments against plague, it is not surprising that the same medicaments can be used for both purposes. So that's the quotation that you have on this slide. He writes, putrefaction itself is poisonous, even if it does not have any other power. Hence, the poisons cannot be removed while the putrefaction remains, and even less if it increases. Therefore, the medicaments are most strongly adverse to the plague, and they are those that resist poisons and at the same time refrigerate and execute, that is, those that extinguish putrefaction and guard against it. Describes it, the goal is to prevent future putrefaction by extricating humors, excreting superfluous humors, making those that are too thick thinner, and those that are too warm colder, concocting those that are still warm, and dissipating noxious humors. Likewise, prevention against the influences of the air consists in prevention against putrefaction through influencing the temperament of humors. So, slide 14. Consequently, in his anti-Paracelsian writings, Erasmus offers a reductionist account of the notion of pharmacological actions of the whole. That's the first book. We say that the whole substance acts because it acts not only through one or two qualities that dominate over the other qualities in mixtures, but rather by the forces of the whole matter, composed and mixed of so and so many parts, and of such and such a nature. And in the second quotation, he gives an explanation of this idea when he says, We understand by whole substance and whole impairment not only the temperature brought about by the mutual action and passion of primary qualities considered, as it is called abstractly, but rather together with the subject matter. It is to denominate in this way the temperament that adheres in so many parts of matter of such and such a quality, or that is aggregated out of so many temperaments of such and such quality of parts. Thus, in Erasmus's view, the only sense of wholeness required to explicate the notion of pharmacological actions of substance is captured by the view that these actions involve the powers of the entirety of elementary qualities entering a temperament, plus the view that these powers never occur outside the material substrate. Now, slide 15. So, in the way he doesn't treat this kind of reductionism as a pure hypothesis. There's a series of arguments for it, and maybe it's useful to look at least into three of them. Well, the first argument derives from the persistence of the pharmacological powers of plant parts after the loss of the substantial form of a plant. These medicaments cannot act through their substantial form because they have lost their substantial form before they become active. This holds especially true for qualities that persist in parts in which no one claims that the substantial form of the plant persists, for example, in powder. So all qualities deriving from the substantial form must disappear when the substantial form disappears. Hence, these pharmacological powers can neither be understood to be the effect of a persisting substantial form nor the persistent effect of a previously subsisting substantial. The second argument derives from the nature of the increase and decrease in intensity. Observation shows that the properties of plants can become more or less intense. For instance, through a change of location and climate conditions, whereas substantial forms cannot undergo an increase or decrease in intensity. Qualitative changes that are relevant to the efficacy of plant-based medicaments cannot be explained through a change on the level of substantial form of the plant. And the third argument starts from variations in pharmacological powers that are due to changes in the bodily constitution of patients. For example, the effect of poison depends on the age of the patient, whereas the contrariety between substantial forms always remains the same. Likewise, the habituation to poison can turn poisons innocuous. Hence, hidden powers of making poisons innocuous do not depend on substantial forms. So, you can see these are really arguments drawn from ontology. And what is really striking about this group of arguments is that Erasmus took into consideration only a single metaphysical option, namely the view that each living being has a single substantial form. And this is exactly what makes the position of Erasmus vulnerable to emergentist objections, such as those found in Mercurial. So I come to the third and last section. On the next slide, you see the title. Slide 16. Yes, emergentism in Mercurialis of. I mean, this is exactly the negation of reductionism. What sets Mercuriale apart from Erastus is Mercuriale's view that there are powers in medicaments that arise from the substantial form. In his discussion of the problem of what could be done if medicaments, as in the case of purging drugs, have unwelcome side effects, uses the concept of correcting medicaments, correctoria, that designates um, drugs that could be added to the problem in drugs. Mercuriale puts forth the thesis that equal quantities of medicaments should be used for this purpose since, as he puts it, the effect of a specific form cannot be impeded but by another specific form, and the equality of specific forms follows the equality of quantity. Describes specific forms to these medicaments, but at the same time, he regards the strength of the powers of these specific forms as being dependent on the quantity of the underlying matter. This conception of ontological dependence again makes it a plausible question to ask whether his account of substantial forms could be understood as a version of emergentism. And I would like to suggest a tentatively positive answer, which, however, needs to go a bit into the possible sources of Mercuriales conception. My suggestion is that one of the central sources for emergentist ideas can be found in Renaissance readings of Averroes' considerations about antidotes. Maybe this is a bit a surprising and unlikely source because the Averroes Latinus never seems to have made a use of the terminology of the eductio of. And actually, I haven't found any modern commentator who has characterized the historical Averroes as an emergent. Things may be a bit different with his Renaissance readers. Um, and my conjecture is that um, Mercuriale may have been quite familiar with the work of commentators such as Alessandro Acchini or Agostino Nivo or Arcangelo Mercenario. Why do I think that this is a plausible conjecture? Well, in his Invenienis et Venenosis Morbis, Mercuriale adopts two arguments brought forth in Averroes' Colleges. First argument runs as follows. That's what you also have on the present. Some poisons can bring about changes both in the temperament and the whole substance of the body. They require antidotes that likewise work not only through their temperament. Averroes counts these among the medicaments that operate using a property which the physicians call the whole substance. Second argument, some antidotes work by attraction, which cannot be reduced to the powers of elements, since none of the primary qualities is the origin of attraction. Averroes argues that attractive power requires proportionality, proportio, and agreement, conveniencia, as it is found, for instance, between a magnet and a piece of iron. As he put it, this proportion and agreement holds only between the quantities of the mixtures of elements in these, that is, in the attracting and the attracted entities. Averroes describes the relation between the powers of the elements and the properties that explain attraction as a relation that cannot be foreseen. It's possible to know, he says, by judgment, the quantity of mixture due to which this operation arises in the entity itself. Operations that derive from matter are known, which are only known by judgment. So there seems to be an anti-reductionist tendency in these remarks, but is it an emergentist tendency? Well, if you look into Simara, Simara really thought that there is an emergentist tendency. Averroes' remark is not outlandish to say that the actions of a single agent are diversified according to the diversified dispositions of the places of the subject. Imara comments, and that is on slide 18. So, well, the first quotation is not on slide, but we can move on to well, the first comment is the activities of active beings inhere in passive and suitably disposed beings, and therefore it is not inconvenient from a single active being out of different dispositions of the subject there arise different actions. Imara thus reads Averroes as asserting that substantial forms arise from the interaction between the multiplicity of external agents and the dispositional qualities of material beings. This reading is fully coherent with the metaphysical views that Zimara ascribes to Averroes in other parts of his comment. For instance, discussing the apparent contradiction between Averroes' view that generation is not a motion because the form is indivisible and the forms of elements become more or less intensive. Zimara comments that concerning motion, two conditions are required. First, subject is a being in actuality, and second, that the form that is acquired is divisible. And for this reason, in forms that are educed from the potentiality of matter, some are perfect, not capable of more or less intensity, as are the forms of mixtures, and those primarily and for those, primarily the saying of the commentators is verified that the generation of such form is not a motion because such forms are indivisible. A little later, it explains, and that's the quotation that you have on the slide. All forms that are educed from the potentiality of matter are divisible, but in living beings, they are indivisible in the sense that the body part cut off from the organic body cannot stay alive, and that the soul of a living being requires an organic body of a minimal size and can only inform a body of maximal size. Likewise, forms of mixtures have both an external and an internal cause and require a certain figure and size. As Zimara understands it, this is in this way, Averroes can combine the view that all forms that are deduced from the potentiality of matter are divisible with the view that the souls of the more perfect beings are more united than the forms of elements. The apparent contradiction between Averroes' view that matter is prior to form and that actuality is prior to potentiality, Zimara suggests that according to Averroes, that's the last quotation on this slide, matter precedes form with respect to generation because form is deduced from the potency of matter, but form precedes matter with respect to perfection. This is a pretty unambiguous articulation of an emergentist reading of Averroes. And I think this is really the context relevant for understanding Mercurialis pharmacological use. We go to slide 19. Um, you get a passage from Mercurialis' book about poison, where he holds that the whole substance consists in the form and temperament, and on Galen's view, that the end of the motion of the heart comes about either through an extraordinary temperament or through the whole substance. Mercuriale comments that this shows that Galen distinguishes between temperament and whole substance. And the interesting thing is that um, Mercuriale explicitly invokes Averroes to support this reading of Galen. So that's the quotation that you have on the slide. Here he writes, it has to be held that qualities of this kind alone cannot make a poison. Rather, they necessarily follow from another form and property. Averroes wanted to understand this when in the Teriaca he spoke about hot and cold poisons and said that they kill with a wondrous heat and cold. If they bring this about not only through heat and coldness, but through wondrous heat that is conjoined with a wondrous power, in such a way that it must be taken for assured that the nature of this kind, which is most hostile to our nature, must be a power superior to elements themselves. Here, Mercuriale uses Averroes' idea that substantial forms of antidotes are bearers of causal properties that cannot be reduced to the causal properties of elements to explicate the galenic notion of pharmacological actions of the whole substance. So maybe we go to slide 20. And I would say that this is the last slide I will present in lecture. Um, and that's from Mercurialis Decompositione Medicamentorum. There, Mercuriale offers an interpretation of Averroes' metaphysics that is strikingly similar to Zimara's. This becomes clear when Mercuriale takes the strength of the powers of specific forms to change not only with the quantity of underlying matter, but also with qualitative changes of the temperament of elementary qualities. He says, I respond the same as what Averroes says in Metaphysics 8, namely that specific forms follow their temperament, and therefore their temperament is weakened, the power of the specific form is diminished. Why? When in the mixture, the heat of bumiresina is decreased by the coldness of camphor, consequently also the purgative power, and what is worse for us is decreased. Now, Mercurialis' reference to Averroes certainly involves some interpretation, since, as far as I can see in his commentary on Metaphysics 8, Averroes mentions neither the content of temperament, nor the content of specific form, nor the content of reductio. But he does say something that supports Mercurialis' reading when he explicates the sense in which entities that are constituted by matter and form are genuine unities as follows. That's the quotation. cause of the unity is that what is in potentiality is transmuted until it is made actual by an agent that is the being that extracts it from potency to actuality. There is an entity that possesses unity, which was at first in potentiality and subsequently is transformed from potentiality to actuality. This is so because this transformation does not confer multiplicity to this entity, but rather confers perfection in being. And as a whole, this entity is the unity in actuality. Here, Averroes presents the actualization of form from the potentiality of matter as a solution for the problem of how something constituted by matter is not an aggregate of two distinct constituents, but a genuine unity. Problem that for all thinkers who took substantial forms to be added to matter from the outside turned out to be almost unsolvable. Thereby, Hercules' reference to Averroes gives a hint as to possible argumentative foundations for emergentism about substantial forms and their power. So I see that I'm running out of time, and maybe I'll just leave it at that. I think on the last slide I have, there are some remarks about the prophylactic uses of antidotes, where Averroes is also an important background. But here you can see, I mean, Mercurial is not just following Averroes in everything, but he's also criticizing some particular aspect of pharmacology that you can find in Averroes. But maybe we can discuss this in the Q&A section. And for now, I would just like to for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.